So this video is a collection of a couple of favorites and a few characters I just have some stray observations about. This is by no means a top 10 list, it's just a couple of things we can appreciate and learn from. Now the first of these characters is from the game Hob, which was developed by Runic Games. I don't think that they were strictly an indie dev per se, but this was definitely an underappreciated game and it actually led to the closure of the studio. I enjoyed this game a lot, and the main character of Hob is this little cloaked character with a large stone arm. And I've talked before about how much I love this sort of mix between techno and organic. And this character obviously has a few sort of organic cues to them, but the main arm is what's going to kind of initiate a lot of the gameplay in the game. And it's not just a robotic arm, but it's definitely made of sort of this stone, and the entire world around you is kind of this moving and shifting, interlocking system of stones. One of my favorite moments in Hob that happens a few times is as you go to get upgrades for your arm, the character sticks it into this sort of large chamber with a glass top, and you see the arm sort of explode out into multiple pieces, and little arms kind of come out and start tweaking and adding things to it, and then it all kind of collapses back together. And I think it's a really good way to showcase an upgrade as it happens. One thing that's really important in character design, especially for games, is communicating gameplay, or sort of the purpose of things through design. And so this arm is a really good example, not through just the enlarged size of it compared to the rest of his body, the contrast that's there. There's a story reason sort of early on for why the arm looks different than the rest of him. When a lot of the gameplay mechanics and utility that the character has in the game stem from this arm, it's just a really good way to communicate to the player where the power is coming from. As always, character design is more than just arbitrary art, it is design, so it's made to fill a purpose. And a character designer can't just go crazy, they have some constraints that they need to work in. And preferably, their design is going to solve something or solve multiple things. So I think it's kind of interesting with our next character. The game Slime Rancher, when I first started playing it, had no player character. It was pretty bare bones, just the mechanics were in place, a little bit of progression. So the game was really lacking a main character. Now, I brought up constraints and purpose because in this game's case, there aren't actually that many in place for the main character. Because the game is in first person, you only really need to see the bottom right-hand corner of the screen where the character's main tool, the vac pack, is visible for sucking up slimes and throwing them back out. So the main character, Beatrix, was actually added later on in development, and the designers had a little bit of freedom because there weren't really these constraints in place. But overall, I think that Beatrix is a really nice addition to Slime Rancher and the aesthetic that it's going for. Now, for me personally, I love bees. My initials are BEE. My mom keeps honeybees. Anytime I see a bumblebee just trying as hard as they can, I'll just stare forever. Now, Beatrix has this really subtle design in her vac pack. The back of it is this sort of round striped sort of chamber, I guess, for the slimes that looks like a bee's abdomen. And even though Beatrix is a human character that was a late addition to an otherwise slime world, I think she fits really seamlessly into the overall look and aesthetic of the game. Her shape language is overall round, her color palette is really cheery, and I think the outfit that she's wearing strikes this perfect balance between a really capable character, but one who exists in a very harmless world. If you haven't played Slime Rancher, it's such a calm and therapeutic game with no stress. It's like gaming comfort food. Now, I just told you how much I love bees. I think wasps can get the heck out of here. But for our next character, it's one of my favorites in all of indie gaming, and that's Hornet. Now, I've always loved this dynamic that exists between characters like Speed Racer and Racer X. It's especially present in the Mega Man universe. It's between Mega Man and Proto Man, Zero and X. It's where sort of the main character that we know meets their rival character or a similar character who's a bit above them or more advanced than they are. With Mega Man and Proto Man, they're initially sort of rivals who fight against each other even though they're on the same side. The opening of Mega Man X does this really interesting thing where Zero comes in to save X, and he sort of exists as the very upgraded version, sort of what you can aspire to be by the end of the game. Now, Hornet comes from the game Hollow Knight, And the main character, the Knight, is a pretty decent character design in his own right, but I think Hornet shines as just a really awesome character. Overall, her design is super simplistic. All you have is the large horns and masked head, the red cape that kind of flows out over most of her body, the needle, the weapon that she carries with a little bit of string hanging off the end of it, and then just the two black legs extending down. Otherwise, there isn't much that you see of like sort of what's under the cape or anything, so she really exists in those three parts, those three segments. And just speaking of meeting a character who's more advanced than the main character, when the Knight and Hornet first meet in the game, Hornet's on just a whole nother level compared to the Knight, and all of this is showcased through these really graceful and elegant animations that the character has. Hornet's the best. I gotta put this up somewhere. I think that Hornet teaches us that we can do a lot with a little if you're smart about your designs. Again, the character's just made up of those three main segments, but yet they're able to carry out a lot with it. Really graceful movements, this really cool air of mystery, and honestly it makes you want to play as Hornet more than the main character. And from what I've read, that is a planned DLC, so I'm really looking forward to that. I love when a great character design can be clever and solve multiple purposes with a single element. And that's why I wanted to bring up Otis from the game Owlboy. Now, Owlboy is a beautiful game. It has a really lush pixel art style that's really detailed, and the main character of Otis has a costume that looks a little bit like sort of a Shakespearean look, right? That white lace collar around his neck and a brown cape that flows behind him. So by just looking at him, he looks like a person in costume. But both of these elements are a little bit reminiscent of owls, right? And that collar around his neck could easily be feathers. And throughout the game, the cape that hangs behind him kind of transforms into the wings that flap. And this brought up something kind of interesting for Omni from Smashified when he went to translate the character into 3D. He had a little bit of a struggle figuring out sort of what these elements actually looked like when they were upscaled. Are they made of feathers like that? Are they partially sort of that lace? How do the overall wings look? Are they comprised of feathers as well, or are they just cloth? And so that's something I just wanted to bring up, because in that pixel art setting, both of those things exist perfectly fine and they don't need to be sort of explained any further. But think or keep in mind, if you're making your own characters, what does this character look like when upscaled or when made hyper-realistic? Sometimes it just turns out nonsensical. But I think if you start in that realistic setting and then boil down, sometimes you'll have better results than if you're just making something simple. And that goes for a lot of character design in general. Knowing what the pieces are yourself, even if you're never describing them to your audience, will typically tend to serve the character design better. Next, I wanted to bring up the main character from a game called Iconoclasts. Now, funny enough, both Owlboy and Iconoclasts are pixel art games that were made by a small team of developers over a long development time. I think Owlboy was like between 8 or 10 years of development. And I bring up Iconoclasts, the main character's name is Robin. I think the best version of the character is the one in-game, the small sprite version, the player-controlled version. The larger version of the character, whether it's in sort of the dialogue box sprite or the digital painted version, doesn't quite resonate with me too much, but I really like the sprite version of the character. One of the main things is the animations. They're really bouncy and fun. Now, as far as conveying something about the character through their design, Robin is a mechanic who carries a small blaster and a large wrench. The wrench cranking animations in the game are really one of the most fun aspects of it. So there's little things in her design, like a ponytail that's in the shape of a wrench on the back of her head. But there's also smaller details. So take this for example, the shape and size of her legs are very small, and they sort of taper down to a little point. Now, what's interesting about that shape and size of her legs and feet is that it does something for the tone of both the game and the character. And it plays into the idea of the character being an underdog, right? So when you equip a character with such small equipment, even though they run and jump, it gives them the feeling of being underprepared, right? It makes you think, can they actually do this? Or how are they overcoming these odds to run and jump? and it might be a little bit silly. It's definitely a small detail, but to me, there's something about that, right? Of course, there are games where your character is the most powerful in that environment, and of course that can be appropriate depending on the game. But to me, I've always enjoyed a character who is an underdog, who is against the odds. And I think that's something that you can convey to the player. The tone, the stakes of the game, all through little details like that. The last indie game I wanted to talk about is Flint Hook. And the main character of Flint Hook is another character with a white mask and some dark eyes, kind of like Hob and Hornet so far. But that main player character is kind of half the preparedness of Batman, the utilitarian nature of all of his tools and his belt, mixed with a cavalier, adventurous nature of a pirate. And Flint Hook takes place in a space pirate environment. Everything is themed after piracy somehow, or boats. The main tool that Flint Hook has is this grappling hook that is in the shape of an anchor. Overall, really cool theming. But the reason that I bring up Flint Hook is actually for its NPC and enemy character designs. They are like the pixel art version of a Jim Henson character, with the wacky nature of the Looney Tunes. All the color palettes are super vibrant and their movement is over the top. And all of that contributes to the tone of your game too, right? If your enemies are all grimdark and gritty, then the overall tone of your game is going to be brought down too, and it possibly could give off sort of a scary vibe, right? But Flint Hook succeeds even if its gameplay is tricky and difficult, with giving you a really good sense of fun through its characters.